Okay. Good morning, everyone. Happy Thursday morning, keeping track of the days. We are now live on Facebook, so that's great. And we have Taylor Ansley with us. So Taylor, we brought him in for Jumpstart April. Thank you so much for doing this, Taylor. And he's going to teach us a little bit about Trello. We'd also love for you to tell us a little bit about your business and, of course, like your family and like your transition during this time, and then teach us some things about Trello.
Sure. Well, thanks so much. Good to be with you all. I wanted to start by just acknowledging that this topic, I think we planned this topic 6 months ago, and now it's kind of even more relevant today with everybody scattered and working from home. My name is Taylor Ansley. I'm the Chief Production Officer of a company called SWEB Development. It's based primarily in San Antonio, but I've been here in Winston for 4 years now, and I'm planning to stay. So I have a little satellite office here at Flywheel and at my house. So yeah, and I just wanted to kind of include that picture of my family just to say I've got 2 little ones running around. So if you hear little squeaks or if I get a little visitor in the middle of this, you'll understand. It's definitely a time of a lot of flexibility for everybody. So I wanted to start by, so the title of the talk is Trello for Remote Teams. I have an alternate title, which is How to Avoid Jira by Using a Jira Product, which will make a little more sense in a minute if you're not familiar with Jira, but we'll get into that in just a sec. For today, my goals are really, first I want to explain why me, why Trello, and then give you a few basic kind of tricks and explanation of how the tool works, then get into maybe some more advanced skills, and finally kind of wrap up with some limitations and some areas where I've found in my experience Trello to not be a great tool for certain activities and things. And really at the end of the day, I'm working in a software and web development context. You're working in your own business organization, and so what I'm hoping to do is just kind of spur some thought and some ideas on your end of ways in which a tool like Trello could be really useful for you. So happy to answer any questions about that afterwards. So first on the kind of why me front, just a little bit about my company. So SWEB Development was founded 12 years ago as a web development shop primarily at the time. Today, this is just a smattering of some of our recent work. We're doing web and mobile app design and development, as well as online marketing. My sort of part of the business is the design and development of web and mobile projects. And there's a whole other very talented team that does online marketing campaigns and ad buys and stuff like that. So really, I've been with the company for 11 years, and in my role, I'm basically overseeing project managers, designers, developers, testers, all of those team members who help deliver really awesome websites, primarily based on WordPress, and native apps for nonprofits, large and small companies, everybody in between. So that's a little bit about my company. And so I've been doing this for a while, and primarily from a sort of project management perspective, I would say. That's kind of my bread and butter. So as a result, I've tried quite a few tools over the years. I've also managed remote teams for quite a while. So here's the kind of SWEB org chart. So you can see we're about 22 people now. There's our kind of, offices in Winston-Salem and San Antonio. And of this org chart, that's me right there. And this chunk of folks, those are all remote folks, and have been for several years. So this, including myself, right? So I've managed people in the San Antonio office being remote myself, and then I've also managed this kind of constellation of remote folks out in the field. And so been doing that for many years now. So, this adjustment, having the kids around is an adjustment for me, but, working in this way really has not been. Now, why Trello? So I mentioned that, we've been at this for a while, and I have tried over the years a lot of different tools for kind of, you might generally call it project management or task management even, project planning. There's a lot of different kind of ways to describe what Trello is. And I've come back to Trello time and time again for a number of reasons. The primary one is kind of confronting this problem, which if you've not seen Jira, so this is Jira, and Jira is well known, you might say infamous in my industry, in the software development industry, though it's used a lot of other places. And Jira is very robust and very powerful, but extremely complicated and has a very steep learning curve for new users. And so this is kind of an industry standard tool in bigger contexts. So I have about 20 people. If you have maybe 200 people, it might make a lot more sense to have a tool that's kind of as involved as this. But I saw this quote several years ago, and it's still one of my favorite quotes, which is, your startup either dies or it lives long enough to use Jira. And that has been true in my experience. I have, we went through a Jira phase at SWEB, and that was sort of a misstep on my part several years ago. And what happened was it just kind of frustrated everyone because of its complexity, because of its learning curve, and just because of its, in the modern web context, Jira's come a long way in terms of interface design and UI, but people are used to kind of modern, clean, nice looking tools. And at the time it sort of had echoes of, kind of the old era of online tools and things like that. So number one for why Trello is really based on kind of simplicity and trying to kind of find the, kind of thread the needle between, features that you're looking for in project management and also something that's really approachable for your team. And that's kind of why steer clear of Jira. I joke that this is a way to avoid using Jira by using a Jira product, because actually after being very successful for many years, Trello was purchased by Jira, I think about 18 months ago. And so today it's actually owned by the same company. I think Jira actually, it's actually kind of very much of an endorsement of what I'm saying, because I think Jira saw Trello as this much more approachable version of a product that they wanted to put on the market. And so instead of trying to build one themselves, which they tried to do for several years, they bought it. So why Trello? And you may hear this term Kanban. And I'm not here to present myself as a Kanban expert. This is actually a term that comes out of the automotive industry originally for sort of continuous improvement. So you may have heard of like the Toyota system and other systems for improving a production process continuously. A guy named Peter Drucker wrote a very important book kind of bringing this concept into like the software development industry, my industry. And really the aspect of Kanban I want to focus on is related to what's called a Kanban board, which is really one of the organizing principles of a tool like Trello. And so Kanban's a lot about flow, and not necessarily this kind of flow, but more like this kind of flow, which is basically the most essential version of like a Kanban board. And basically when we get into Trello, you'll see that this is going to be very familiar looking. And that flow is essentially talking about the flow of work, the flow of a process, right? That something doesn't just go from, oh yeah, we need to do that thing, to, oh, it's done. There's a process involved of, okay, it needs to be prioritized on our backlog. We need to be in the process of doing it. It might require 3 different levels of approvals or 3 different types of testing before it can go live and stuff like that. So it's really trying to visualize and understand the path that work has to take to get accomplished in your company or your organization. So that's one of the key concepts that kind of informs the way Trello is built. And it kind of comes from that initial Kanban idea. Other reason I like Trello, kind of getting back to the learning curve piece. So this is Taco. He's the mascot of Trello. There's a lot of kind of personality infused throughout the product, and it's just a little bit friendlier than a lot of project management software that you might find. It's not quite as like buttoned up and sort of stodgy. So there's just a little bit more personality to it, and as a result, we've onboarded a lot of team members over the years, and folks tend to catch on quickly, and there's helpful little tutorials and stuff like that they can learn, and it just seems to kind of grab people a little bit faster than some of the other things we've tried. I do want to say at this point though, before I get further into kind of evangelizing for Trello, and this is not a paid endorsement for Trello, it probably should be. I should probably look into that, but Trello, like any tool, is going to only be as valuable as you and your team are using it consistently. And over the years, the tools we've tried that have worked have been the ones that folks have relied upon as part of their daily and hourly routine. And it's been the kind of canonical source of, status and things like that inside of our organization. When we have failed, like with Jira, it's when the tool kind of gets in the way of using it consistently because it's frustrating, because it's complicated, because I don't know how to do something, all those sorts of things. And so whether it's Trello or any other tool you use, my biggest lesson in project management in 11 years is it's only as valuable as it's used. And I think that that's something, even with Flywheel, we see that with Slack, right? I think we're using Slack a lot more now because, it's more necessary as we're all scattered to the winds. But, that's the kind of tool where its value only increases as it's used. And so Trello or anything else you try is going to fall into that category. So if for whatever reason you can't get folks on board with Trello, you might have to look elsewhere to find something that'll be used consistently, because even if you love it, if people aren't going to be in there every day, it's just not going to be any use for you. All right, so with that said, I think I've covered why me and why Trello a little bit. I'm happy to answer any questions at the end about that. I did want to cover a few of the basics, and apologies if anybody's already a little bit familiar with Trello, but just wanted to kind of make sure everybody's on the same page before we get into more advanced features here. So the sort of atomic unit of Trello, the basic piece, is a card. And a card, you can think of it as a task, an issue, a bug, it might be like a feature you want to build on a product roadmap, something like that. But that's sort of the primary first unit that you're going to start with in Trello. Cards live on lists. That's pretty straightforward, right? So you have a number of items, they all live in this kind of column. Again, this goes back to that Kanban approach, right? So you have kind of your whatever columns you designate on your board, and each list contains as many cards as you need. And then lists live on a board. So you could have, and there's a lot of different ways to organize boards. We can get into that a little later, but you could have a particular board for each project, a board for each person, whatever makes sense, and then kind of organize your lists and cards within those. A card itself is, a pretty important piece of Trello, right? So when you open up a card on the board, you're going to see things like a title, right? Obviously, you're going to see a cover photo potentially. You're going to see a description. That description is in Markdown, which is probably a topic for another day, but essentially Markdown is just a way to write text with some formatting included, like bold text and links and stuff like that, without having to use any HTML or anything like that. So it's kind of a shorthand, but you can just write plain text if you want. You'll see on this example some custom fields. I'll get back to those in just a minute and explain how those work. But cards also have as many attachments as you need to include, right? So files, screenshots of an issue, that sort of thing. There's a whole comment section at the bottom, which works about how you'd expect, right? So, it has a lot of the modern features you come to expect from other tools. So you can tag somebody else in a comment and they'll get a notification about it. You can, add an attachment to a comment to show an issue or, eliminate something and whatnot. Then over here we have, I gotta minimize my little zoom thing so I can see my label here. This section of buttons over here are sort of, I label them add more. These are all kind of things you can do to sort of add stuff to a card, right? So you'll see members, so you can basically add people to that card to assign responsibility and things. You can add labels, which I'll show you in a moment, which are basically little, just color tabs, kind of like your little sticky note flags you might put on a document or something, just to indicate, a status or responsibility or something like that. You can add checklists, due dates, attachments, that sort of thing there. And then all of these other buttons down here are sort of more of actions. So, one of the powerful things about Trello is, you can move a card from one board to another, copy a card and make a new copy on somebody else's board. You can make a template, that sort of thing. So all of these pieces are kind of part of what constitutes the basics of a card. So I think with that in mind, love to kind of take a little field trip here, and I'll actually just pull up some of our Trello boards. I think this is the kind of thing that makes a little more sense to see in practice sometimes. So let me switch my screen over here, and hopefully you're seeing Trello in action now. So what you see here is basically the homepage of Trello once you've logged in. Does a pretty good job of basically surfacing what it thinks would be the most important information to you, right? So this section up here at the top are sort of cards that have been assigned to me and have action on them recently, right? So I could always, from here do a quick reply to a comment, or I can, just kind of dismiss this message and see the next item, right? So here I've got this is a comment that somebody left on a card, and if I wanted to quickly reply or just, give him a thumbs up real quick, I could do that. And then over here on the right, I have, some of my boards that I've assigned a star to, things that I want to kind of come back to frequently. So that's always helpful. And then if I want to access all my boards, I can do so through this little drop-down menu over here. I'm going to start out showing you a board that we call Projects Overview. So this is basically within our company. This is supposed to be sort of the 30,000-foot view of our current active projects from the web and mobile side of things. And so you can see our kind of Kanban approach here, right? So we have our columns from on hold to kind of charting the course left to right through the course of a project, right? So a project goes from discovery to design to development to testing to ready for launch, to launched to, I should probably put this over here, post-launch edits, right? And so you can see that in Trello, if I wanted to add another list, it's as simple as coming over here and typing in the name of the list, and voila, there it is. If there's some other step I need to add to this process. And similarly, I can always reorganize and move lists around as I just did with that post-launch edits list. This view for us is very important because it basically just gives us a bird's eye view at any given time on kind of where we are with all of our projects as a whole, so that we can kind of see, okay, we're starting to really kind of stack up projects here in this design phase. We need to start making sure we're moving those projects through as quickly as we can so that we can get more, moved into development and further down the line, right? So it allows us to see where some bottlenecks are forming, where folks might be a little bit, overtaxed in terms of their ability to cover, a bunch of projects at once and things like that. And so here, that's kind of what we use this board for. It's one of many boards we use, and we'll get into some of the others in a moment. This is much less kind of task specific and kind of small cards and much more big picture, right? So one thing that we do on this board is every week, our project managers come in here and basically just add a comment on each card, indicating kind of what happened on the project that week, what needs to happen next, just a sentence or two, just kind of updating everybody. And that means that, if one of my project managers is out sick tomorrow and I need to just kind of double check on what has been going on with one of his projects and make sure that nothing has to happen today, I can come here as a good, quick, refresher on kind of where we are and what I might need to take care of. You'll notice that there are little people on these cards. So what we've done here is basically me or one of my project managers have responsibility for each of these projects, right? And so that's, we've added them to the card right up here as a member here at the top. You can always add new members based on whoever's kind of on the board. And that just is a way of, so anyone who's a member of a card will get a little notification anytime a comment's added to that card. It's kind of like they're an observer on that card. And if they wanted to later go back and see all of the cards assigned to them across all boards, they could do that if they're kind of attached to a card. You'll see here at the top, these are the folks who are part of the board. So one thing is, you can add somebody to a card, but only after they've been kind of added to the board in general. It kind of makes sense, right? You've got to kind of let them in the door before you can give them assignments and things. I also wanted to show you on this board how we're using labels. So you might see little swatches of color here and there, right? So primarily here we have yellow, black, and red. So we have set up these labels. So if I go here to the labels section of the card, you'll see that I have labels for, in this case, we really just use these three: waiting for client action or review, needs attention, and stuck or on hold. So those just kind of, again, in the sense that this is a very big picture board for us, it gives us a very clear visual on, projects that needs attention generally means like, we need to make some progress on this project. We're a little bit behind on this project, et cetera. Waiting for client action review is pretty self-explanatory, but it's helpful in terms of like, seeing a big picture view where we're kind of beholden to a client for content or feedback or something like that to move forward. And Sucker on Hold, also pretty straightforward, but very helpful to know, because it can kind of give us an idea where we might need to do a little prodding or something to try to move a project along. I also have these labels at the bottom, which are actually hidden labels. So they don't show a little color swatch on the front of the card, but what they allow me to do is to filter. So like in our case, if I go over here to the menu and I go to search cards, I can filter by, cards containing any of these labels. So if I want to immediately see only the cards that need attention, I can just click that and it filters out the view to show me just those cards. And I can clear the results. And similarly, I can use one of these hidden labels. So if I want to see only our WordPress projects, I could similarly, filter that down. So if there's a reason where I needed to see, okay, I'm wondering if we have, all the developers ready to tackle the next crop of WordPress projects coming through, I could kind of focus the view a little bit to get that, kind of clearer perspective. And the last thing I wanted to show on this particular board is that one custom field. I mentioned custom fields earlier. So if I go to this card, for example, you'll notice that we have right here in this section a custom field where we identify the developer. So we have a sort of network of developers that we work with. We've got I think we have 8 web developers at the moment. Some of them full-time, some of them on contract. And so it's really helpful for our project management team, again, on that kind of big picture view, to kind of be able to see, okay, who's going to be assigned to this project. And so this is basically just set up as a little drop-down field here. And these custom fields are basically just configured right over here. So I can go to edit this power-up settings. There's my developer field. And if I need to add a new developer or remove somebody to show in that drop-down field, I can do that here. And each custom field can be shown on the front of the card. So there's this little checkbox. If I uncheck that, it hides it. But we like to show that information on the front of the card because, again, it just helps to be able to, without having to dive into any particular card, you'd be able to basically just take that quick view and see, okay, that's Lois and that's Luke and that's Anton and that sort of thing. I did want to mention this menu as well. We didn't really talk about this earlier, but over here, the menu has some options for the board as a whole. So one important option is the search cards function we just talked about. So you can either do, cards assigned to a particular person, cards with a particular label, or just, search by, keyword and things like that. Other things that you do through the menu over here include any of your power-ups. So we'll get into that in a minute when it comes to the advanced functionality, but these are things like custom fields and automation and other things that you can do with Trello. And then I also wanted to touch briefly on the notifications here. So this little bell menu, I don't have any unread notifications, otherwise it would be red, but you can kind of see that this is basically giving you comments that you've been tagged in, comments on cards that you created or that you are assigned to, things like that. So if I go to view all, you'll see some more examples here, right? So this was, it'll give you, if you set a due date on a card, it'll tell you, something's coming up, it should be due soon. If somebody, moves a card that you set up to a different list or board, it tells you. So it's basically just kind of an activity stream, but Trello does a pretty good job of filtering out that stream to only include things that it thinks are relevant to you specifically. So you won't see, by default, a notification when anything happens across your board. It's basically just cards you've been assigned to or have created, things like that. Great. One last thing before we go back to the presentation here, I did want to show you on this home view. This is something that I always request that people bookmark for themselves. If you go to your little profile avatar at the top right and you click on cards, you'll see basically a view that filters all the cards that are assigned to you. And you can do that either by board or by due date if you wanted to. And this can be really helpful if your organization is using a lot of different Trello boards, because one of the potential downfalls of Trello is you end up with maybe 15 different Trello boards and you've got 2 cards over here and 1 card over here and 3 cards over there. And seeing the the whole of that sum can sometimes be hard if that's your setup. So in this case, like what we have is, this view where I can see, okay, on these different boards, here are the items that I'm responsible for, and kind of shortcut to them. And if you open one up, it'll take you directly to that card on that board. So that can be really helpful. All right, let's get back into this here. All right, so everybody take a deep breath. That was a lot of information, I'm sure. Those are the basics. So, I mean, imagine what the advanced stuff is like. But no, hopefully that was pretty intuitive. It's the kind of tool that, the more you use it, the more it makes sense. So if you find yourself a little overwhelmed by some of the basics, have no fear. I think once you kind of get in there yourself and start clicking around, and be a little easier to understand. But let's go into advanced mode. So I just have a few things I wanted to talk about with advanced mode. I won't drag you too deep into the detail here, but I did want to talk about a couple of key pieces of Trello functionality that we have really gained a lot by over the years. The first is a tool that Trello offers. I believe this might only be offered on their paid plan, so that's another caveat. We have a business plan with Trello. It's pretty reasonable. I think it's $12 a user a month or something like that. But because we have that business account, I don't know at this moment which of these features are paid versus free. So your mileage may vary. But if you have access to BUTLER, which is the automation tool that Trello offers, it's really, really powerful to basically make your board do some of the work for you. So for example, you can set up in BUTLER a series of rules. And so you can see here in my screenshot a couple of examples. So one would be like, when a card, any card is added to the list, ready for SWEB review by anyone, remove all people from that card and add me to that card, Taylor Ansley, right? So that would be an example where I want to be notified and assigned a card anytime it's ready to be tested for a particular project. And so regardless of who's assigned to that for development and who's been working on it, as soon as they move it over to that ready for SWEB review testing column, it's going to remove everybody from that and assign it to me. And that just like takes away probably 3 or 4 clicks that the developer would have to do when they're moving that item over, right? So it's just like those little paper cuts, right, that drive people away from using these project management tools consistently. You can kind of apply some automation and some logic to just make it a little bit easier. And also, it makes sure it's kind of that, I like to think of it as like a fail safe, right? I'm very into like the Atul Gawande's book, The Checklist Manifesto, and I really believe in like checklists and don't just assume that you're going to remember all the steps and stuff like that. Yes, bud. Sorry, here's my little visitor.
And I want some. I'm hungry.
Okay, I'll be with you in like 20 minutes.
No.
Ask brother to give you a snack.
No, but it's not a parent.
Yeah, but he can give you a snack.
No.
Sorry, guys. Okay, so here, sit with me for a minute. All right, so in terms of this automation, we have, Abel, you gotta go, buddy. All right, why don't you give me about 30 seconds to get some pretzels or something for him?
Yep, go ahead. I need a snack too.
Sorry, be right back.
Good morning, everyone. Just good morning. Coffee.
Morning. Good to see you.
Oh, hi, Margaret.
Hi, Andrea.
Thanks for joining us.
Sure.
Oh, we have lots of people. I didn't even realize how many people we had on here until I shifted over. Good morning, John, Adrian, Mona, Katie Dixon. Hi, Katie. Hi, Tom. Hi, Alan. I feel like, what was that, Romper Room back in our day? The Magic Mirror.
Oh, that's right. Yes.
Showing my age there.
Sorry, guys. Back in
No
action.
problem. I got to say good morning to everybody.
Okay, good. Sorry about that. All right, get back into this here. Yes, so rules. So really this tool, I think of it as like your checklist manifesto. It's your way to ensure that what you want to happen happens every time without somebody having to remember it, right? So in this particular case, it's like developer finishes an item, moves it over to the ready for SWEB review board, might forget to take themselves off the card and assign it to me, so I would never see it, right? So in this case, it's just kind of adding that automation on the back end so that every time they do that, that happens and nobody has to think about it. So that's really helpful for us. And I'll kind of go into some of the rules that we have deployed in just a moment. Another one I wanted to touch on, we just kind of mentioned this briefly, are custom fields, right? So this is interesting because not only can you do things like I just showed you where you have a little drop down to pick which developer is assigned to a project or something like that, but also we have tied our custom rules with our custom fields with our rules a little bit in BUTLER, so that, for example, I have an ability to pick from a drop down, which site I'm talking about, and based on a rule that I have set up, it'll automatically plug in the dev site URL, the production site URL, and the client name on a card, for example. And that can be really helpful just because it's information, again, that information is available to our team through other places if they wanted to look up, well, what's the dev URL for this site or whatnot. But again, it's just easier if it's all right there on the Trello card. They don't have to look that up every time, and I don't have to type it in every single time either. So I can just kind of make that selection and have it pop up. So there's text fields, there's drop downs, there's a couple of different options for custom fields, and those are just kind of pieces of information you want to kind of highlight and surface sort of above the description and things like that on a card, just to kind of give better context for the task or the project or whatever the card is relating to. All right, let's go back to the board here. Let me pull up my other board. So I'm going to show you now a board that gets a lot of traffic on our team, and that is our WordPress maintenance board. So one of the things that we do as a company is we build these new websites, we redesign and launch these new sites, and then we have a huge number of clients who lean on us for maintenance requests, right? So that could be something like I want to add a new feature, a new page, a new section of my site, etc. Or clients sometimes break things on their sites, right? So, oh, this broke, or we need to fix this or whatnot, or things like that. So we use this to track kind of across, I would say probably 30 different projects, could have a card that ends up on this board. And obviously, like, not every project has a card at every moment. And so, here we have, again, our Kanban approach, right? Where we start, the list on the left is a sort of different story, but we start here with our maintenance backlog, and it's what I love to see. The backlog is empty right now, so that's great. But as we get new requests, we'd add a request here, and we just I'm gonna add this card, and I'm gonna tell my technical lead Lois to ignore it. But when I add it, you'll see why I tell her to ignore it. The rules I have in place are going to automatically assign Lois to that card because I added it to maintenance backlog. And you'll see that it also added this little checklist here. And we haven't really talked very much about Trello checklists, but I'll show you what that looks like. So here we have, pretty basic process for, a WordPress maintenance task. And as a result, we have that BUTLER automation I just showed you automatically add a checklist to the card as soon as it's created. So we're going to say, okay, we want the developer to make the change on the dev site. We're going to test the change on the dev site. Then we're going to deploy it to production and then test on production and then notify the client, right? And so, very simple steps, but again, there are two reasons why that's on the card. Number one is, it just reiterates every single time a card is created, like we don't, unless there are very particular circumstances, we don't make a change directly on production. We want to make it on the dev site first. And the other thing that this does is it gives a shortcut to moving cards around the board. So let's say I set up this card for Lois, I add a description here, fill out your census, which everyone should do. And then I assign it over to Lois. Let's say I select one of our projects here, right? So it's going to update these fields with the URLs that I had in there, right? And then Lois is going to make the change. Maybe she'll add a screenshot or something, and then she will check this box saying she's made the change, right? As soon as that happens, you'll see things are happening in the background there, and all of a sudden the backlog's clear again because this card's now been moved down to this column, ready for SWEB review, right? So it's been assigned to one of our project managers, Phil. It's been assigned this label, ready for SWEB review. And it's in this list so that it's ready for him to look at now, right? So all of that happened as soon as I checked that box happened because we had set up some rules for the board, right? So we'd use BUTLER and said, anytime somebody checks a box that says, make change on dev site, we want you to assign it to Phil, put this label on it, move it to this list. And so it's just the kind of thing where it just it removes so much friction from using the board for all of our team members, right? It was a lot easier for Lois to do that than to take herself off, assign it to Phil, put that label on, move it over to the next list. And it's a lot easier for Phil because he makes sure he gets notified as soon as that item is ready. And so similarly, once Phil's gotten a chance to test on the dev site, he'll check this box, and all of a sudden, we'll have more things happen, and it's going to go back over to the maintenance backlog. And look, now we have a label that says ready for production. So it can kind of start to feel a little bit magical in the sense of like, oh yeah, like that is our process, right? Like that's how we want things to work. And it can kind of take care of itself in the background just with some of these rules set up. So let me show you a little bit about how those rules look in the BUTLER tool here so that it maybe is a little more concrete. So I'm opening up BUTLER and I'm going to go to this rules area. And you'll see we have a lot of different rules we've set up. Basically BUTLER, this is actually a bit of a criticism because I think it would make more sense in a different way. But the way Trello has it set up, every rule you've ever created for any board kind of shows up here in your account, but you'll notice that there's a few that are checked as enabled on this board, right? So here's one of the cards you just saw in action. When a card is added to the list ready for SWEB review by anyone, remove anybody who's currently assigned to that card and add my project manager, Phil, to that card for testing, right? So that's one example. Scrolling down a little bit more, so here's another one you just saw in action, right? When the developer make change on dev site item is checked, right? So when somebody checks that off the checklist, take everybody off the card, add Phil to it, apply that ready for SWEB review label, and move it over to ready for SWEB review. So that's kind of that process that we talked about based on that checklist. For the actual checklist to be added to the card, here's how that happens, right? When a card is added to the list, maintenance backlog, go ahead and add the process checklist from another card. So basically you have to add that checklist to a card as kind of your template, and then say, okay, copy this checklist, put it on this card, and put Lois on it when it's added. So if anybody's ever used a tool called like If This Then That, or Zapier maybe for automation, it's very kind of similar process. When you create a new rule, which I can do really quick, you basically set a trigger for it. Like what happens to trigger that action? Is it because a card was moved, because a card changed in some way, right? Like I want to know anytime there's an attachment put on a card, or I want to see anytime a label is changed. You can have it based on date, right? So every Friday, I want something to happen to all my cards. I want everything in the done column to be archived at Friday at 5 p.m. or something like that. You can have it based on checklists, like this rule we just talked about, right? When a particular item is checked off, or when something is added to a checklist and want something to happen. Do it based on comments and cards and stuff like this. And you can do it based on custom fields as well. And then once you've added that comment, so let's see, when a card is added to the board by me, let's make that our trigger. Now you have all these series of actions, right? And so, just like with if this then that, this is the that portion, right? So the if is the card's added to the board by me. The that is, okay, when it is added to the board by me, I want to join that card, right? And I want to, add a label that says, to do on that card. And all those sorts of things. And so you can basically just start to add and stack those actions to just basically kind of inform your workflow a little bit. I did also want to show, we don't use these as much, but there are options in BUTLER for adding card buttons. And those can be kind of helpful. So there are a couple on this board. If I go to one of these cards here, you'll see right here, I have these options here. One actually connects to Jira, which is, Lois uses Jira a little bit with her team. So that's kind of a funny overlap there. But hold for review and ready to deploy to production are two buttons we've added to this board. And when I click this button, you'll see that I get a little change in that card. So it's going to basically mark it as ready for production, which is a purple label. I actually don't know where it went. Well, that's what's supposed to happen anyway. But yeah, so you can add those BUTLER buttons to your cards to make things happen. It's basically like, think of it as, if you saw those rules, they all have a trigger associated with them that usually involve like the card changing in some way or somebody taking an action. This is just another way of having a trigger, right? It's just literally a button on the card. When somebody presses it, things happen. You can also add board buttons. We've not used these either, but that could be something like if you wanted a cleanup button on the board that when it was clicked would archive all the cards that have a certain label on them or something. So if you have a label that says finished and every Friday you want to basically be able to clean that out after you've reviewed everything, you could have a board wide button that would do it. So there's a lot of power here to this BUTLER piece. I mean, I would say even using Trello for years, I've not scratched very, very deep into this this tool yet, and there's a lot that probably could be added that would help our workflow that we'll get into with time. So that's kind of covers the BUTLER automation piece, and we talked a little bit about the custom fields. Two more advanced things I wanted to talk about, and then I'm sure you all will have some questions. The first kind of relates to how cards end up on our Trello boards. So you saw me add this card, right? So that's one way. I can just basically come into Trello and start typing, which is very helpful. And when you get an email or a phone call from a client, and you just need to kind of quickly get something set up. Another way though is through integration with other tools. So we have, for example, we use Typeform. You could use SurveyMonkey or any other kind of survey tool. But we use Typeform, and for some of our clients, though not all, because every client's a little different with what they prefer, we have like a ticket form set up for support requests. And so it asks things like, who are you? Which site are we talking about? Is it a bug or a new feature you want to add? Do you have any details, et cetera? And we have connected this Typeform form to Trello, which shows up on the list somewhere down here. And when that happens, basically, anytime a new form response is submitted, it will automatically create a Trello card on the board that we designate. So for the clients who we do support requests through Typeform for, that will mean that they go to their Typeform, they submit their request, and in addition to getting like a little email notification about it, it'll go ahead and set it up on Trello so that we can immediately assign it over to a developer to look into, or we can assign it to a tester to do some more triage work on before we figure out what the issue is and stuff like that. So it's just another one of those, friction reducers, basically, like a way to just kind of try to tie it all together so that folks aren't spending their days, copying and pasting stuff from email to Trello, or, writing by hand all the, Trello cards that they need to assign. So that's, I think, really helpful. And you could use, like, in addition to something like Typeform or SurveyMonkey, you could use Zapier to do that. There are extensions on Chrome where you can, from your Gmail account, you can create a Trello card and it copies over the text of the email into the description. So like there's a lot of ways in which you can kind of make creating Trello cards as easy as possible. And all of those things will help with the ability of your team to consistently kind of dive into the work. And then the final thing I wanted to mention here is related to, let's see, the launch checklist. So we have, we've launched 2 websites this week, right? We probably have averaged about a launch every 2 weeks for the last couple months. And so we're launching a lot of sites. And when we launch a site, there's a lot of things that have to happen, right? And we've learned the hard way over the years that we need to make a really extensive checklist of these things, otherwise things get missed, right? Otherwise we launch a site and we forget to add the fave icon until right after launch, or we, forgot to update the form delivery so that the form is, when somebody submits the contact form, it goes to the right person at the client or something like that. And so what we've set up over time is this pretty extensive checklist of all the things that have to happen before we can launch, and then all the things that have to happen right after we launch, right? And so basically every time we run into any kind of issue, we have a little, we used to call them post-mortem meetings, and now we call them postpartum meetings because it kind of felt a little more hopeful. But we try to talk about basically right after a site launch, like what went wrong and what went right, and what do we need to kind of improve on next time, kind of consistent with that Kanban philosophy. And so when we have something that went wrong and we're like, oh yeah, we should have checked this, or yeah, we forgot to do this piece and we had to fix it right after launch, try to add that to the checklist for next time. And we've set up this card, which is our launch checklist, as a template. And so anytime we want to create a card on a particular project from this template, we have this button here. We've got a launch checklist for whatever site we're launching that week. And then we can go through and check off all the items. And again, I think this is just one of those things where I think checklists kind of, they sometimes seem like kind of overwrought, it's like, okay, well, I'm always going to remember that. Why do I need to have it on a checklist? But just having it on the checklist, especially with a remote team, it helps keep everybody in sync, right? What's happened, what's still pending, what do we need to make sure is covered? And, it just kind of puts everybody's mind at ease, right? You can put your brain energy into thinking of the more important stuff and not having to remember all of these, kind of predictable, repeatable processes. All right, so that's a ton of information, I know, and yeah, definitely happy to dig into more of those details and questions if you have any. All right, so that's kind of the overview, the basics and the advanced stuff, when it relates to Trello. So I think, hopefully the takeaway from that is not just a sense of overwhelm, but hopefully the takeaway from that is, wow, it's a really powerful tool. I wonder, maybe you have a lot of ideas of how you could use that, in your business or in your organization, with different processes and different projects that you're running. But I do want to throw in like a word of caution before I kind of, set you off into the sunset of Trello land. And one of those items is just that there are certain things that over the years I have found Trello to not be the ideal platform or forum for, right? So one of those is lasting documentation. By that I mean things like, so in my world, it's things like requirements documents or project briefs and things like that. There are ways that people have kind of hacked Trello into kind of being a repository for some documentation, right? So one example I see often is people will create like a column on their Trello board that says, documentation or sticky or something like that. And it'll be a series of cards, and it'll be, here's the sitemap and here's the timeline and here's the project brief and stuff like that. And you can certainly do that. And if it works for you, like, go for it. But what I have found is that the place for lasting documentation is really much better in like something like Google Docs, or maybe your team uses a similar product from Microsoft or something else. But really basically just kind of a tool that is geared around documents and, writing and basically kind of keeping all those things in sync. And that will live beyond like, a Trello board, because maybe you finish a project and you want to close that Trello board. You need to reference that documentation 6 months later because of a question from a client or something like that. So we try to keep all that lasting kind of long life documentation outside of Trello. And you could always link to something or attach something to a Trello card if it's relevant, but we like to try to kind of keep that separation. You saw that Trello has this commenting functionality, which might make you think, okay, great, well, we can kind of hash something out on a Trello card, comment, 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 comment. What I have found is that comments are useful, in terms of time shifting, right? So if you're on a slightly different schedule than one of your remote employees, or if you want to kind of just make sure a decision is documented or something like that, comments can be really useful for that. We use comments on that project's overview board just to kind of have a consistent weekly check-in on all those projects and make sure we're kind of capturing the big picture of where we are. And that's really useful. But for really rapid back and forth, we use Slack as a company, and I think it's a much better tool for, I think of that as like kind of hashing out a quick detail, right? Like somebody's not understanding a comment and, need to just kind of have a back and forth and share a couple screenshots and stuff like that. That can feel really, that can start to feel a little cumbersome in Trello, but it's a lot easier on a chat tool like Slack, right? And then the final one is just, kind of that deep detailed conversation, right? And something like this, like a Zoom meeting or a video conference, is a much better vehicle for that than having a kind of a long extended, conversation, making decisions on a Trello card, I found. So just good things to keep in mind, as you kind of start to dabble with the tool a little bit, what it might not be best suited for. And instead, the things I would consider using it for are some of these, sort of smaller chunk items, right? So we use it for all of our support tickets and whatnot, repeatable processes like our launch list, and then, things like product roadmaps or event planning and things like that. Those are all great, uses of Trello. All right, with that, I'm going to close my mouth and open it up for questions, and really appreciate your time, and hopefully this was useful to you. And if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer. I'm on Slack through Flywheel, and I'm also available at my email address there. So Andrea and Mason, you want to take it from here?
So I have a question.
Yeah.
Yes. So my question is, I've run marketing and sales teams predominantly, as well as also some development teams. I've found structure like this and checklist works great in development teams, but I've had a hard time getting salespeople and marketing people to adopt structured approaches like this. And I was wondering if you have tried to, say, apply Trello in your organization to other parts of the organization like sales and marketing, and how that went, and if you might have any advice for doing that compared to something like, it's hard to even get them to use Slack sometimes. They're like stuck on email.
Sure. Yeah, no, it makes sense. And that's absolutely true. And there's always a spectrum, right? There's always a spectrum of adoption and of kind of enthusiasm for the tool. And I would say the things that have helped us over the years, number one, picking a tool and sticking with it, right? We had a series of years where we were dabbling and, okay, let's try Jira for a while. Let's try this other tool for a while. Let's go back to Trello, and even just the consistency of saying, like, what, Trello has its limitations. It has a few warts to it, but we're going to stick with it, has helped a lot, right? So that means that all the senior managers have, 2, 3, 4 years of experience using the tool. You kind of pass that down to their team. And the other thing that has helped is, not expecting everyone on the team to be the person who's going to set up a template, right? Or set up an automation, or, get it all configured. You have to kind of have like your Trello champion, right, on your team, who's going to be the one to go into the board and say, okay, I'm going to set up all these rules so that when things get moved here and this and that, all these items are going to happen. And then you can kind of sell the benefit to the salespeople and the marketing people without selling the complexity, right? So you can basically just say, look, all you have to do is when you make that call, you check this checkbox, or you press this button saying, contacted, and everything else from there takes care of itself. You don't have to add a comment, you don't have to move it around, whatever, but we get what we need out of it, which is sort of like, okay, did that person take care of that thing? And all it took for you was clicking a button. And so that's really, I think, helped us as well, is kind of understanding who in the organization is going to be willing to kind of take a deep dive into this automation stuff that can feel a little overwhelming to normal people, and then who is going to be able to kind of understand the benefits without having to dive into that.
I'll ask another question if that's all right. So I think you have significant intellectual property on this. You basically put your process onto Trello, which is kind of a blank canvas. So I'm just curious how long that took you, and did the usage of it in the organization evolve over time as it was developed and got better and a closer fit with how you wanted to operate?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say that, again, kind of in that Kanban mindset, we have evolved a lot over the years and continue to do so, right? I mean, even I'd say 3 months ago, we switched primarily from a project-based board approach. So you'll see here, like if I show my boards, a lot of these are kind of project specific, right? So Accelerate is an iPad app we develop, and Chef is a client we work with. And that was our approach for a long time, was, okay, every project needs its own board, right? And what we realized over time is that the way we were using Trello was not necessarily, okay, we have a new website and we need to, here are all the steps of the new website. It's like, well, actually we're using Google Docs for all of our analysis documentation and stuff. We're using Adobe XD for all of our design work and showing that to a client. We have a site mapping tool that we use. So we're using all of these other tools, and what we're really ultimately using Trello for is at the very end of the project, when we're doing all of our testing and debugging, to create kind of lists of issues and tweaks and things like that that need to be changed. And having a board for every project just means that those issues end up scattered, in all these kind of far-flung corners, and it's harder for our development team to kind of find those issues and understand what's the priority and things like that. So what we've done is we've actually switched much more to a process where we have a board for each developer, and on their board they have their cards across a variety of projects, right? And so that's been a big improvement for us.
BUTLER to load their individual.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we can kind of move things around, and when something's ready to be reviewed, it can bounce over to somebody else's board. So we've taken much more of that approach recently as an iteration on just trying to make sure everything's much more clear. And similarly, like on the WordPress maintenance board, in the past, all of these 30-some projects would have been their own board, right? And so every 6 months, maybe you get a card on some random board that you've never seen before saying, fix this issue. And you're wondering, okay, well, is this important? Can this be ignored? What we've established with our team that does all of our maintenance is basically to say, okay, the top item on this list is always the most important priority. And we're going to reorder this list of backlog as we go to make sure that it's always ordered by priority. So there's never any question about what's the next item on your list to tackle and things like that. It's always going to be the top item on the list. And so that, again, that's been a real helpful iteration for us. And I would say that we definitely erred on the side of spreading our work out across way too many boards initially, because it kind of made sense conceptually to think of it that way. But then we started thinking about it as more like, okay, well, what is the person who's doing the work need to see in their kind of overview to be most effective?
Yeah, so you've evolved towards function. So would that mean, for example, you've got a maintenance board? Would you also maybe have like a asset design board for the website?
Yeah, so the way we've structured that is primarily like our project managers and our designers have their own boards, right? So here is one of my project managers' boards, for example. And so we just launched a website called SmartBar. So that was the launch checklist there for SmartBar. And we put that on his board because he was responsible for that ultimately, even though I was coming in here and checking items off that checklist. And similarly, like here are a couple other projects he's responsible for, and these are items he's waiting for follow-up from a client on, or is otherwise kind of responsible for taking care of. And we do the same thing with our designers. They have their own boards as well, so we can have a column for the project and say, okay, we need design for this aspect of the site, or we need these revisions to be completed and stuff like that.
So does that mean you've moved away from project boards to individual boards, or your project boards integrate with your individual team members' boards?
It's kind of a mix depending on where we are in a project. So in these initial stages of these projects, these are all in kind of a discovery phase. So we don't need developers to be involved in that project quite yet. But instead, we have basically a number of items that need follow up and things like that from a project manager. And then once we get later in the stages of development on a project, we kind of move that over to either a developer's particular board or to a kind of overall project board, so we can track all the bugs that come up, all the issues that need to be fixed, etc.
Right. Okay. Cool.
Hey, Taylor. Oh, I had a question. Sorry.
Yes.
Andrea, were you done?
Yes.
We're good.
Go ahead.
Okay. Hi, good morning. Great info. I am finding that I'm getting overwhelmed with emails, and you mentioned that we could transport or transition emails to projects or cards. How do we do that? Is it just copy and paste, or is there some more coordinated way?
So there are several options. So one would be, and sorry, I'm going to walk and talk because I have to get some more yogurt for the 3-year-old who's very demanding. He's the most demanding boss I've ever had. There are a couple of options for that. So one is just a strict copy and paste, which obviously is not ideal. The other option is if you use a tool like Gmail, and you're using it in Chrome, there's a little add-on that you can add to Gmail that can basically have a little side panel when you're looking at your email that will create a Trello card from the email that you're looking at. So let's say you open up an email and you need to do something with it. You can open that little Trello side panel and it will copy over the content of that email, right? So the body of the email as the description of the Trello card.
And that's only in Chrome.
That's in Chrome with Gmail, but there are some other ways to do it as well. You could there's an option to email things to a board as well. So if you go into the settings here, it gives you this long, complicated email address, right? That you can email things to a board, and you can basically say, okay, when I email something to this, I want it to go on this particular list, and I want to put it at the top or the bottom. And that's kind of a good, blunt force way as well. You probably would end up in a situation where once the cards end up on Trello, you might want to kind of massage them a little bit and make them more sensible based on the emails. But that's definitely an easy option to just kind of get a bunch of stuff on the board that you can then deal with in kind of an inbox way. Okay,
cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
Will BUTLER classify incoming emails?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there is a BUTLER setting for email as a trigger.
That'd be cool.
Check that right now. Yeah, I mean, I think in particular, you can use even just if a card is added to the board, do this, and you could probably look for something in the card to indicate it came from email.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, thanks. I'd never seen the automations. I've been a free user for a long time.
Yeah, it definitely kind of sold us on going ahead and putting up the credit card. Yeah, it's very powerful, and for a long time, and Trello has a lot of like extensions, kind of paid and free add-ons that different third-party developers have built over the years. And there were a lot of automation things built like that worked okay for a long time, but then Trello decided to do it themselves, and obviously their kind of native solution is just a lot more reliable than some of those third-party things.
Mm-hmm.
This is great. I just recently started using, or this year started using Google Keeps, which was like so simple but so life-changing for me. It got me out of my paper planner, which was working great, and enabled me to keep all different projects, all in one place. So this looks to me like a more extensive version of that. Now that I've gotten used to that and the way I like to separate things, I can see how that can translate here. But you can, add so much more to your card and so much more functionality. So I think that would be a good transition.
Yeah, and that's a good point because, I think there is a place for kind of a personal task management system that maybe is separate from Trello. And I think some people, you can certainly use Trello for that. And some people do, and that's great. And whatever system you use for that, is fine. But for me personally, I use Trello as more of like tasks that involve other people, right? So things that need to be reviewed later, tested, designed, et cetera, right? Like that type of interaction. But then I keep like a separate, like kind of, task list of just my stuff, personally, that's much more detailed and minute, filled with minutia, just because like for me, that separation kind of makes sense mentally in terms of my mental model. But it's definitely not how you have to do it. You saw checklists. You can add a full checklist to a task, to have all that minutia there. But that's just one example of the way I use it. But again, there's 1,000 ways to do it.
Yeah, perfect. We're a couple minutes past time, and actually our staff has a meeting right after this, so hopefully we'll kind of discuss what everybody thinks of this from a Flywheel staff perspective as well. But does anyone have any other quick questions before we thank Taylor and sign off?
No, it was great. Thank you.
Thank you, Taylor.
Great. Thank you all so much for being here. Hope everybody's staying safe and healthy.
All right. Bye.
Thank you so much, Taylor. This has been really, really helpful and great to see your face.
Likewise. Miss everybody.
Bye.
See you eventually.
Okay.